Today we're at Carnoy Military Cemetery and we're here to tell the story of the East Surrey Regiment, and more specifically Captain Wilfred Neville, better known as Billy Neville, who led the East Surreys in their attack on the first day of the Battle of the Somme. On the first day of the Battle of the Somme, in the trenches just south of Montauban, the 8th East Surreys were waiting to go over the top into heavy fire. Captain Billy Neville was worried about how his men were going to react when they went into combat for the first time, when they really went out there and came under fire. He was worried about how they would experience something that they hadn't experienced before, how they would react to that. And he decided to deal with that problem by giving them a symbol of familiarity, something that they would recognise from home and something that might motivate them as they attacked across no man's land. When he was on leave prior to the 1st of July, Captain Neville had decided that he was going to deal with this problem by buying some footballs. His plan was that he was going to give footballs to his men that they could kick ahead of them across no man's land as they advanced. Something to distract them, something to maybe even keep them motivated, maybe feel some kind of glimmer of hope or happiness in a situation that Captain Neville suspected might be pretty bad. There were even rumours that he had offered a prize to the first unit that scored a goal into the German frontline trench. Now, when people hear this story, it's sometimes told as one of naivety, or, how stupid were they to kick footballs across no man's land into an attack, but that isn't what it was about. It was about Captain Neville's desire to give those guys something familiar and something that they could hold on to as they advanced into hell on the first day of the Somme across no man's land. Give them that familiarity. So we've just come out a little bit to the kind of fields in between Carnoy and Montauban, and this is where the British front line would have run through, and roughly where the East Surreys would have attacked from towards Montauban to try and take their objective of Breslau Trench. At 7:27 a.m. 1st of July 1916, the first day of the Battle of the Somme, B Company of the East Surreys attacked over the top here and across no man's land, led by Captain Neville, as he kicked his footballs ahead of him to try and motivate his men and bring them forwards. They went into a murderous attack. Machine gun fire, artillery fire bore down on them. Maybe because of the footballs and the way in which Captain Neville motivated them across no man's land, they took their objective. They did manage to successfully attack and capture Breslau Trench. They scored a goal into that frontline German trench. Unfortunately, Captain Neville was not there to celebrate that goal. As with many men from the East Surreys, he was killed here during the attack across no man's land. It's believed he went down fairly early on in the attack as he bravely led his East Surreys out here into no man's land across towards Montauban. He was killed somewhere just out here. Second Lieutenant C.W. Alcock wrote to Neville's sister soon after he had been killed. He wrote, 5 minutes before 0 hour, your brother strolled up in his usual calm way and we shared a last joke before going over. The company went over the top very well, with Soames and your brother kicking off with the company footballs. Okay, so we've just made our way back over to Carnoy Military Cemetery to come to the grave of Billy Neville, which is just here behind. As you can see, is already a little bit decorated, but we've got some decoration that we've bought for it as well. Something special for Billy here at Carnoy Military Cemetery. So Billy Neville was a football fan, so we have got him a flag, but it's also got a little badge on there. It is the Three Lions badge of the England football team, which I thought would be a nice touch. So I'm a big England football fan myself, so we're going to lay this flag here at the grave of Billy Neville. So here we go. I'm going to put this in here. Somebody has put a picture of Billy Neville here as well, so I want to make sure that I don't block that off. The ground here is quite tough, so I'm going to find a little spot where we can get it in. There we go. It says a lot about Billy's character that a lot of people wanted to write to his family after his death on the first day of the Somme. And I've already shared one letter with you, but I thought I would share another one that somebody wrote to his mother. Major A.P.B. Irwin paid his tribute when he wrote to Neville's mother. He was one of the bravest men I have ever met, and was loved and trusted by his men to such a degree they would have followed him anywhere. Today we're at Newfoundland Memorial Park by Beaumont Hamel, and we're here to explore probably the best preserved section of the Western Front, here by Beaumont Hamel. Newfoundland Memorial Park is a 74-acre area of preserved battlefield. It was purchased by the Newfoundland people in 1921, and it's been preserved as the largest memorial for a battalion here, with this whole park being in commemoration of them. Now there's other things here as well as Newfoundland, related memorials. There's a couple of cemeteries and some other bits here, but there is also a huge amount of preserved trench line here that you get to see such detail, frontline trenches, communication trenches, that you don't get to see in other areas of the Western Front. And so we've come here to explore today, and I think it's going to be really, really interesting. So this whole area is just cratered and kind of riddled with old trench lines. You've got, to give you some kind of perspective, behind us over here we have the support line trenches, where the kind of reserve trenches were. And you guys who are a bit more familiar with kind of how the Western Front mapped out, you had a frontline trench, then you would have communication trenches that ran back from that, and then you'd have support line trenches, and so on and so on. So it really was kind of like a maze of trenches. It wasn't just like one line at the front. So behind us is where the kind of support line trenches were, and the communication trenches that worked their way through towards the front line. And then here behind me, this is what was the British frontline trench on the first day of the Battle of the Somme. Across behind us here is no man's land, and over on the far kind of ridge line over there, that's where the German frontline trenches were. So this was no man's land. This was the battleground here on the first day of the Somme. The first guys to attack here on the 1st of July were the Royal Inniskilling Fusiliers, and they attacked here across no man's land, leaving this British frontline trench at about 7:30 in the morning. They attacked straight across here towards the German front line, and suffered some awful casualties. 568 killed, wounded or missing men. To the left of them over here, the 2nd South Wales Borderers attacked as well, towards the German fortress of Ravine, which is in the German front line across the other side of no man's land here. We're going to go look at that in just a minute. The initial attack had failed, and so reserve troops from behind here had to be brought forwards for the second wave of the attack. Okay, so just wanted to kind of reference that again, what we're talking about here. So this in front of us here is the British frontline trench. This is where the British left from on the first day of the Somme. Now, sometimes a bit of confusion when people visit here, because there is actually a second trench, or another trench, I should say, dug further out into no man's land, and people will always wonder what that trench is for. Well, that's actually from later in the Battle of the Somme, where this attack here was unsuccessful. The Battle of the Somme carried on here until November of 1916. 16. And in a latter part of that battle, there was a further trench built, advanced out there in no man's land in order to make this ground a little bit shorter to cross. On the first day of the Somme, this was the British frontline trench right here in front of us. You can see it runs from over there, along here, down there to the left, and then across no man's land over there. On that tree line is where the German front line was. Now you can see straight away, as soon as someone steps out of this front line trench, they are going downhill across this open piece of ground with a clear view from the German front line. So we've come further back now in the Memorial Park, and this is the St John's Road support trench. Back here, the Newfoundland Regiment, the guys who this park is named after, were waiting in order to move forwards in a later wave of the attack. After that first attack had suffered heavy losses and had ultimately been unsuccessful, these guys were tasked with moving forwards from this position. Now they've actually got it set up here so that you can walk down into some of these trenches. They have kind of like sort of planks and stuff set up, so you're not just kind of walking on the actual ground, but you really get a good idea of kind of how these trench systems worked and the way in which they went through, and you kind of get a rough idea. You can't really see exactly where we are, but we're quite far back from what was the front line here, and this is where the Newfoundlanders started from. They had to start advancing through these communication trenches to get to the front line trench. So we're now walking along what was the support trench, the St John's Road support trench. This section we've walked in is where it would have come through, and then up there ahead of us you can see where it would have continued along. So these guys had to start advancing forwards. Now we're very lucky, we have this nicely made path. Those guys, however, were advancing along through these communication trenches to get towards the front line. Now the problem was, these communication trenches and these support kind of second row trenches just ahead of us were getting really filled up with casualties, wounded men trying to work their way back from the front line, queues of men trying to get forward to the front line. They were just absolutely congested, and their officers were worried that if they were taking too long to get towards the front line and therefore their attack was delayed, that it would cause more problems. So the Newfoundlanders were actually ordered out of their trenches back here by their support trench and had to advance above ground like we're doing right now towards the front line. Now we've come back forwards a little bit here, and you can see where these communication trenches would have run through towards the front, and they've actually got it set up so again you can walk through what was one of these communication trenches here. But the problem was, around here was the area where, because it was so congested, these guys were ordered up and out of their trenches. Now the problem with that is that this is where the ground has really opened up, and as soon as you step above ground here from the communication trench, you are really in the wide open, trying to advance forwards to your own front line. Okay, so we're now moving up through the communication trench. They've got this set up so you can walk through. This is where those guys were getting so bogged down, casualties trying to come the other way, dead men laying in these trenches who had gone over the top previously and had either fallen straight back down or maybe been dragged back in by their comrades. Casualties lying all over the place. They just couldn't get forwards. We're still a good distance back from the front line here, probably maybe not quite 100 meters, but a good distance back. And so as we walk through here and keep following the line of this trench, we're about to get a bird's eye view of what happens if you had to climb out of this communication trench and start pushing towards your own front line. Okay, so we're still here in the kind of support communication trench sort of area. So This is what happens if you have to climb out of this communication trench this far back from the front line. Let's go up these steps. And as soon as these guys did this, you see how exposed they were across towards the British front line, which is out there by that kind of second path ahead of us, and across to where the German front line is, literally just over by those trees. Advance. These guys were in the wide open, trying to advance forwards before they'd even reached their own front lines. So the Newfoundlanders were trying to cross this land that we're walking across right now, and you've seen the view across to the front line, and the reality of it is that they were just absolutely decimated. Guys hit, killed and wounded before they'd even got to their own front line, trying to cross this open ground here. Some did get beyond the front line and started walking towards the German front line. Some got quite some distance across, but ultimately the Newfoundland Regiment suffered 710 casualties, killed, wounded or missing here. Really was some awful losses here. That wasn't the last attack of the day here. The 1st Essex followed them and attacked as well. They too were absolutely devastated here. Massive losses. The Ravine in the German defences over there proved to be an impenetrable fortress on the first day of the Somme, and in fact would stay that way right through until the latter parts of the Battle of the Somme, when it was finally captured. Now when you get out here to this part of no man's land, they have a tree, and this tree is named the Danger Tree. Now there's rumours that this is the original tree, but I think I've read that this is like a replacement tree. But there was a tree right here on this spot on the first day of the Battle of the Somme. Now you can see we're not quite in the middle of no man's land. We're probably about a third of the way across, but where we are right here, you can see up here, kind of sort of on the ridge line here, is where the British front line was, and this is where these guys were advancing towards the German front line over there. This is the part where things got really sticky for them, because they were crossing this slope. Now here you can see the land kind of drops down, and there's actually a little bit of a dip then kind of going back up. So I guess if guys made it to this point, they maybe had a slightly better situation than they had further back here. The problem was that they didn't, and in fact this tree represents pretty much the furthest point that these guys got as they attacked across no man's land here towards the German front line. So as we walk out here into the middle, this is where you get a real good perspective of kind of how open this was, and we're quite high up here, but the ground kind of drops down, and you can also see behind me here a good view. I mentioned there was another trench line. Well, that's that one that's out there behind us, that was dug later in the latter attack during the Battle of the Somme towards November, to try to shorten this ground. You know, the guys dug out and then built a new front line. So people often get confused and think that's the front line, but actually that was built later. The British front line on the 1st of July was the one we've looked at back there. You can see all the ground here is just absolutely peppered with shell holes. Some behind us here, some quite big ones actually, and all across. There's another pretty big one right there. And the thing that's becomes very apparent is that a lot of these shell holes are right around where the frontline trenches were. These shell holes in particular are all near that frontline trench that was later in November, but back up when you're up by the original front line as well, that entire area is just covered with shell holes. So you can see how the German artillery had these guys fairly well zeroed in and were giving them a hell of a time, as I'm sure the British were for the German front lines. But still, it really does demonstrate to you that it was not a good place to be. So we've come across now, so we're on the other side of no man's land, and over on this side they have the Ravine Cemetery, which is where a lot of the guys who were killed here are buried, are laid to rest. Just wanted to quickly touch on, I mentioned that advanced trench, that was called the Wellington Trench, by the way. That's the one that was used in the latter attack towards the German frontline position here, and that was largely led by the 51st Highland Division, who successfully took Ravine and the German frontline's positions here, but they also suffered terrible losses. And so Ravine Cemetery has guys from Newfoundland Regiment and the various other regiments who attacked here, but we'll also see a lot of graves in here from the 51st Highland Division. So I just wanted to quickly reference that part of the story before we take a look in Ravine Cemetery right here. As we come in here, we straight away have quite a few graves here from the South Wales borderers. I mentioned that these guys attacked off to the left here. Newfoundland memorial graves. A soldier of the Great War, Royal Newfoundland Regiment. So somebody who, you know, it would have been identified that they were part of the Newfoundland Regiment, maybe uniform or, you know, cap badge, something like that. But who the individual was unfortunately not able to be identified. Private Millwood, South Wales borderers. Private Taylor, South Wales borderers. So I mentioned the Highlanders. We have Lance Corporal C. Mundell, the Gordon Highlanders, Private Mitchell of the Gordon Highlanders, and lots of others, lots of Highlanders graves here at Ravine. So we've just walked across the other side now to where the German frontline positions were, and you can see behind us some remains of where the German frontline trench went up. What's interesting here is they have Ravine, which is a big natural landscape just behind us, and in fact we're going to talk all about that in a video coming up real soon, to keep an eye out for that video. But where you kind of lead forwards here into then the German front line, you really start to get an idea of the view that they had across no man's land here. Real strong protection, so they could have, you know, a lot of their soldiers down in the dugouts by Ravine, probably sentries out here in the front, or some guys in the front line. Then when they needed to, bang, soldiers out in the front line manning those machine guns with clear views across no man's land here. So you really do get real perspective of why the attack here failed so badly, because of the view the Germans had across no man's land. So here's probably the best spot where you get a view of what I mean. I mean, this is a deep trench here, and sorry to confirm, this is the German frontline trench, but it's really deep compared to the British ones on the other side. It looks a bit wider too, so I imagine it was probably slightly more fortified, but they had been here for a long old time. They'd been in this section longer than the British had, and so really had a chance to dig in and dig defences properly. Now, for the attackers on the 1st of July here, success would be determined by their ability to take Ravine, which is just over there through those trees behind us. Now, the problem they had was, you can see the way this land kind of slopes towards us, and then the way it drops off back through those trees into Ravine. The attackers really could not see the detail of what it was and just how fortified it was, which meant the Germans, safely down there in their bunkers, were able to hide away during the vast bombardment from the British prior to the first day of the Battle of the Somme. So I've just come on up on top by the Caribou Monument here. It's much busier in the park now, so I've been here really early in the day, but now it's getting into kind of regular hours, so there's lots of people turning up. I just thought I'd film some clips, because from up here you get a real good perspective of what went on here. So to give you an idea, off to the left here, this is where the support line trench was. So St John's Road trench through here, and through here is the communication trenches. So this is the land the guys would have had to cross before they got to their own front line. Where all these kids are now, this is the still the support line trench, and then out there on the other side of the fence you can kind of see running across in the field, like over kind of where that further path comes through, that is where the British front line trench was. And ahead of us there is no man's land, and on the far side those trees over there, that's the German front line. So you really do get a great perspective from up here to see this piece of land. It's one of my favourite spots to be on the Western Front. This, A, because there's so much here to see, but B, just because you can really see the perspective of how a battle like this went. There are a few places on the Western Front where you can see a British front line, open no man's land, a German front line, and you really do get a clear idea of what happened here. I hope you guys enjoyed this look around the Newfoundland Memorial Park at the Somme near Beaumont Hamel. Favourite is a tough word to use when you're talking about the Somme Battlefields, but it really is one of my favourite places to visit. It's a fascinating place and obviously a very tragic place as well. Thanks for joining me as I looked around. I'll see you on the next video. Today we're at Delville Wood, a place that saw some ferocious fighting during the Battle of the Somme, and it's also the place where the South Africans went into combat for the first time during the Battle of the Somme here. Now, before we get started, it's worth noting that the South African involvement in the Great War was not without controversy. It was less than 15 years earlier that the British Empire had been in war during the Second Boer War against the Boer Republic. Now, only 15 years later, people from those same communities are being asked to fight as part of the British Commonwealth Army in the Great War. But nonetheless, they showed up, and they showed up in force. And on the 14th of July, they would go into the front lines here at Delville Wood. By the 14th of July, the British Army had pushed up here to the edge of Delville Wood. By this stage, we're some 2 weeks after the first day of the Battle of the Somme. And this is where the 1st South African Brigade were going to go into action. They would be tasked with pushing beyond the existing British front line and capturing Delville Wood. Now, they would enter the woods at the point where the British front line met the edge of those woods, and that was down in the southwest corner of Delville Wood. And they actually have a marker that marks the point of entry where the South Africans went into those woods for the first time. Okay, so I've just come up to the marker that I mentioned, and right here you can see we are on the edge of the woods, moving kind of north, sort of east from where the British front line was. The South African troops moved forwards here into Delville Wood. So the British had got up to kind of the edge of the woods here by the 14th of July, and as this marker tells us, at 7 AM on the 15th of July, the South Africans moved into Delville Wood, right here at this location where I'm stood now. Here we go. Here's the marker, and you can see advancing in a northeasterly direction at 7 AM on the 15th of July 1916. The attacking force of the South African Infantry Brigade entered Delville Wood at this point. So this is where the guys came through here along the edge of the wood and headed in to Delville Wood. Okay, so the first thing that has struck me straight away, I'm just walking further into the woods from that entry point there, and the ground here is just taken to bits. I'm walking up and down shell holes and holes in this ground. The ground here has just been absolutely destroyed, and my goodness, it gives you an idea of what the guys were dealing with when they were here in these woods. Now, just like the marker where we were, where the South Africans entered the wood, they have these markers all through the woods now to represent what are called rides, and that is basically the kind of open lines that run between the trees through these woods. So, for example, we've got one here that is marked Rotten Row, and Buchanan Street, that went Rotten Row this way and Buchanan Street this way, to kind of give some sort of reference of where you are. Now, the rides were named by the South Africans and the British soldiers who came in here, and a lot of them are named after streets in London. So there is a Prince's Street, there's the Strand, and various other ones here through Delville Wood. Under the command of Brigadier General Henry Lukin, 3 battalions of the 1st South African Brigade entered the woods right here and moved their way forwards. Now, they initially actually managed to capture the woods relatively easily. There was some resistance, but not a huge amount, and they managed to push through and started advancing out towards the far edge of the woods here. By the afternoon, the South Africans had captured the woods, but unfortunately the Germans knew the importance of holding this place and capturing this place, and so they launched ferocious counterattacks back through these woods again and again, as well as heavily bombarding this entire area with artillery. Now, the problem is, you can see behind me, and in fact everywhere here, apart from these rides that are out in front of us, everywhere in the wooded area is thick and dense undergrowth, and the problem was that made it really difficult for the guys to dig in here. They couldn't dig foxholes or trenches. There were so many tree roots and everything getting in their way. It really stopped them from digging in properly. As well as that, as artillery came in here, trees were exploding, and there were shrapnel wounds coming from bits of tree that were being fired in every direction. You can imagine the hellish place that this would have been under those circumstances. Now, Brigadier General Lukin had been given express strict orders that he was to hold this ground at all costs. So the Germans were bombing this place with artillery and then sending counterattacks into these woods. You can't see very far. In some sections you can barely see 10-20 foot in front of you, even today. And so you can imagine how dense this was. There was sometimes very close-up combat, dense hand-to-hand fighting in and around these trees. And when that wasn't happening, the guys here were getting bombed with artillery. So you can really start to get a feel of the place that this was, and actually as I've just walked up here as I'm talking, you can see off behind me here the ground is just absolutely peppered with shell holes and evidence of the bombardments that took place here. So as you get into kind of we're not near the middle of the woods, but kind of sort of the in from the edge around this point here is where Henry Lukin would have held his headquarters. It says on the plaque here, here in a shallow trench stood the battle headquarters of the South African infantry during the fighting of Delville Wood. So as a reference point, kind of back over there is where the South Africans entered these woods. You can see the ground here is just torn up. So don't get any impression that Brigadier General Lukin was sort of hidden back away from the fighting, because the amount of shell holes and the damage on this ground right near where his headquarters was tells you that he was certainly right in the thick of the fighting going on here. So we just come up to another one of these markers here. This one marks Prince's Street, which runs down pretty much all the way through Delville Wood here ahead of us. This line runs through, not quite at the midpoint, a little bit south of the midpoint, but we're getting out into kind of the middle of the woods here now. Now, the problem was, as well as the counterattacks and the artillery fire the guys were suffering from here, once they'd pushed out and taken the perimeter of the woods here, the South Africans were still near enough surrounded. The Germans held the ground on three sides of these woods, pretty much, and it created like a salient that went around, a salient being a bulge in the line that went around the perimeter of these woods. So those counterattacks that were coming into the woods were coming from all different directions, and that, combined with the fact that the woods here are so dense and so thick, meant the guys were getting lost and confused. Units were getting separated. At some point they didn't know, was it friendly troops or enemy troops to the right or the left, and that created such confusion here, that it was really kind of every direction, hand-to-hand fighting. In some sections along the Western Front, you have a very clear British line and then enemy line, and it was not like that here. This was fighting coming from all different angles. Ferocious fighting. And when you see the density of it all, you can start to see what I mean when I say it was, hand to hand, up close. You can barely see 20 foot into these woods right here. This is a good spot to really get an idea of what I'm saying about the density of these woods. Now, of course, a lot of these trees are new. They wouldn't have been here at the time. There would have been trees here though. This was a very dense wood at the time, but of course a lot of the trees that were here back then have been destroyed or blown to bits by artillery. But you can see the density of the woods. Well, Eric, and on that note, I mentioned about trees. There's one tree I want to show you. So I talked about trees, and I mentioned that there were trees here at the time, just different trees from the ones that are here. Well, all but one of them. Right here in the middle of the woods, there is this tree, and it is called the last tree, because this is believed to be the only tree that remains from the battles here during the Battle of the Somme. Most of the rest of them, being destroyed with the amount of artillery that was coming here into the woods, but this one tree remains. One of few things that survived these woods unscathed, and I'm sure it was not like it is today. I'm sure it was just destroyed heavily, but it lived and it grew again, and it's now a huge flourishing tree. It's amazing to see a piece of history right here that would have been here and seen all of that action around it. Wow. So as we get out here into the middle of the woods, now we kind of start to get a feeling. As I mentioned, the woods were still surrounded on most sides by the Germans. And the problem was the different units here didn't know, when someone else got pushed back, they then didn't know with those guys to the right of them the enemy or friendly troops. And you had different pockets of fighting, and it just turned into an absolute melee in these woods. And that contributed to a lot of the casualties here, because, it couldn't be structured or organized in ways like it normally would in this type of combat, and the thickness of the woods and the trees here just made it horrendous for them as they tried to work out what was going on. Who's that up ahead, who's that to my left, who is behind me even. It really was a thankless task here. After 6 days of brutal fighting here, the South Africans were eventually removed from these sections of the woods and taken off the front line. The South Africans had entered the woods here at Delville Wood on the 15th of July with a strength of 121 officers, 3,032 other ranked men. At their roll call on the 21st of July, they numbered 29 officers and 751 other ranks. Now, in the middle of Delville Wood here, they have the South African monument here to commemorate all the South Africans who've lost their lives. They also have a really cool museum, which is kind of through here behind me. I haven't filmed in there, but if ever you come here, I really recommend checking that out, because they've got some really cool stuff in there that's well worth checking out as well. So outside the front of the kind of museum, so it's in between the museum and the memorial here, they have a wall which has got all the names of those who lost their lives. Now, it's worth noting that these names on these two walls are actually all those men who've been killed, as opposed to like a wall of the missing, like you often get in these kind of memorials. The South African missing men are actually named in and amongst the memorials with the British soldiers, rather than being separate, like the Canadian memorials and so on. The South Africans are named on places like Thiepval and along the other memorials with the British. But here, so both sides of this, all the way down, the memorial's just here behind me. Names of, thousands of names. Wow. Following the Great War in 1920, this whole piece of land was purchased by the South Africans and kept and preserved as a memorial to those, with this being a place of such sacrifice for the South Africans. This was the place preserved to act in that way, and that's why when you walk around here it is so well kept. And an area on the battlefields here at the Western Front, I guess a little bit like the Newfoundland Memorial Park, where it really is one of the best preserved areas, and where you can still see shell holes and some kind of shallow trench remains that really do kind of show you what went on here. And this is one of the places, probably more so than most, where you can really feel like, oh my goodness, such thick undergrowth, and not knowing who was around you, it would have been a horrible place to be. But I'm thankful that it's been preserved in this way so that we can come and see it today. So just out the front of Delville Wood here, you can see, this is the wood behind me, and you can see the museum and the monument I talked about. Just across the road here, you have the cemetery, where a lot of the men who were killed here are buried. Now, I should say that a huge proportion of the South Africans who were killed in Delville Wood do not have a known grave, and maybe given the circumstances in there, it's perhaps sadly not surprising. So this cemetery has graves from all over. And actually Chris from Blogging Through History is here as well, and he was just saying he's had a walk around here and he can see people from all over the British Commonwealth in this cemetery. I believe this is the third largest Commonwealth grave cemetery here on the Somme. So if you do ever come to the Somme, I highly recommend visiting the cemetery here at Delville Wood. A little side story to Delville Wood, but perhaps helps kind of explain the way it was seen by the guys who were here. A few different places along the Somme were called different names. Like Mouquet Farm is Mucky Farm, and Ocean Villas is Ocean Villas and stuff like that. But Delville Wood was called Devil's Wood by the guys who fought here. And whilst I guess that's kind of an obvious play on names, Delville, Devil, but I guess perhaps it speaks to what the guys thought about what it was like to be in the lines in these woods and to fight in these woods. Delville Wood. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. I've got to say, I've been to the Somme a few times now, and this is the first time I'd visited Delville Wood. And yeah, having been here, it is probably one of my favourite places along the Somme. So if you do come here, I highly recommend visiting Delville Wood. Check it out, there's lots to see, really worth having a look around there. Thanks for watching, guys. Hope you enjoyed this video. See you on the next one. We've talked a fair bit on this channel about the first day of the Battle of the Somme, and of course, being a British guy, I've talked a lot about that from the perspective of the British and Commonwealth soldiers who fought here. Well, today we're going to take a look at the Battle of the Somme from a German point of view, and we're going to do that right here at Ravine in Newfoundland Memorial Park near Beaumont Hamel. Wye Ravine was a natural feature in the land here that lay between the British front lines and the village of Beaumont Hamel. The German Württemberg 26th Division occupied this position here for 18 months, and they took full advantage of that time. They fortified it, put in deep dugouts, some that had the ability to have hundreds of soldiers in there to sleep and to protect themselves from the German bombardments that came here at the Somme. This really is a heavily fortified piece of land that the British would have to attack on the first day of the Somme. You can see behind me here kind of where Wye Ravine comes through, and then just ahead of us here, kind of this side of it leads into then what was the British front line directly ahead. So they actually had a pretty solid setup here with a really strong defensive feature feeding directly into their front line, slightly more above ground just here ahead of us. So I've kind of come round to the side here to give us like an end-on view down Wye Ravine, and you can see, I mean, I'm hoping it kind of demonstrates on camera just how deep this is, but runs all the way through, and they took full advantage of this. This enabled them to bring supplies forwards, men forwards, really down low. I mean, the bottom of the ravine kind of in some sections here is probably 30 feet, and so enabled them to really have a good amount of protection as they brought supplies forwards, men forwards. They had a real good view from the surrounding area here. They had trenches that came out into the frontline trench, which is just ahead of us over here, and this is some of the German frontline trench right here. A view all the way across. I mean, I'm stood in a bit of a dip right now, but you can see all the way across to kind of Hawthorne Ridge over there. In fact, you can just see the tops of the trees. You can see over this van. And then up from the frontline trench just ahead of us, a clear view all the way across what is now Newfoundland Memorial Park towards the British front line. But you really do get an idea of how solid this piece of land was, and the Germans here took full advantage of it. Now, for the attackers on the 1st of July here, success would be determined by their ability to take Wye Ravine, which is just over there through those trees behind us. Now, the problem they had was, you can see the way this land kind of slopes towards us, and then the way it drops off back through those trees into Wye Ravine. The attackers really could not see the detail of what it was and just how fortified it was, which meant the Germans safely down there in their bunkers were able to hide away during the vast bombardment from the British prior to the first day of the Battle of the Somme. So prior to the first day of the Battle of the Somme, the British adopted a tactic of putting down a heavy bombardment on all of the German frontline positions here for 7 days. The British leadership really believed that would decimate the German front lines and any defences along with defenders that were in those areas. However, in places like this and many other places on the front line, the Germans were hidden away in deep dugouts, safely away from that bombardment. Now, whilst they were away from that bombardment, it didn't mean that it didn't affect them. And in fact, we've got an account from a German soldier who was hiding away in one of those bunkers prior to the first day of the Somme. Stephen Westman was a German officer here somewhere, not specifically here at Wye Ravine, but somewhere here along the front line. And he said, "We were under incessant bombardment, day and night. Shells, heavy and light ones, came upon us. Our dugouts crumbled, they fell upon us, and we had to dig ourselves out, and our comrades out. Sometimes we found them suffocated, sometimes smashed to pulp. Soldiers in the bunkers became hysterical. They wanted to run out, and fights developed to keep them in the comparative safety of our deep bunkers. Even the rats became hysterical. They came into our flimsy shelters to seek refuge from this terrific artillery fire. We had nothing to eat, nothing to drink, but constantly shell after shell burst upon us." So you start to see that whilst the Germans were safely, within reason, away in their bunkers, this was not a nice experience for them. And you can imagine 7 days this went on for, 24 hours a day. It must be tough to survive, and it's no wonder that people became hysterical and went crazy in those circumstances. During this time, the Germans knew there was an attack coming. There had been a huge build-up of British troops and equipment beyond the British front line, and reconnaissance, aerial reconnaissance, spotting balloons, things like that had picked up on all of this. So it was no surprise to the Germans that a British attack was coming, and they were training for it. They were doing training drills of how quickly could they get out of their dugouts and get into position and set up their machine guns. You know, again and again, drills, you know, to go from hidden away to ready to fire a machine gun on the front line. And they were getting ready for that attack, and that attack came, as we well know now, on the 1st of July 1916. Sergeant George Busher, who served here on the Somme front line, remembered what it was like. Suddenly the shellfire came down on us with diabolical fury. We were being ripened for the Tommies' attack. 2 hours later they advanced under cover of a moving barrage, thin lines of steel helmeted figures. Our fire devoured them greedily. Fresh lines came on and were still devoured. Still more and more came. Either way, they were utterly careless of death, or else, what was far more likely, they had been doped with whiskey. As we learned in our previous video, the first to attack here at Ravine were the Royal Inniskilling Fusiliers. They suffered 568 casualties within the first few minutes of the attack here. After them came the Newfoundland Regiment, and they again were decimated out there in no man's land, suffering 710 killed and wounded. After the Newfoundlanders, the 1st Essex attacked here, and they were decimated as well. In some places along the front line, the German machine guns fired no less than 20,000 rounds that day. 20,000 rounds into the British soldiers attacking across no man's land. There's various accounts of German machine gunners being left with hand injuries, blisters and cuts from the incessant use of firing those machine guns through the course of the morning on the first day of the Somme. Following the machine gun fire, the German artillery came down on no man's land, and George Busher remembers what he saw from his German front line. Then our barrage came down. No barrage could have been more intense or more compact. That stopped the Tommies, and they went to earth in a line of shell holes right among the heaped up bodies of their dead. The carnage was unbelievable. So too was the English bravery. So the British attack largely failed in most sectors across the Somme on the 1st of July 1916, and that in turn means that it was a successful defensive effort by the German troops in various sectors, like right here at Ravine in Newfoundland Memorial Park. That doesn't, however, mean that they had a nice time of it. You know, that barrage they went through for 7 days prior to that attack, and then the horrors of being attacked so aggressively for a prolonged period on the morning of the 1st of July was a tough thing for the German soldiers to deal with. So the German soldiers suffered the horrors of war much like the British and Commonwealth troops did. And in fact, on the first day of the Somme, the Germans suffered somewhere between 10 and 12,000 casualties. So with that number of casualties, whilst it might have been a successful day, I don't think it could ever be classed as a good day on the first day of the Battle of the Somme. Thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed this video. Make sure you stick around for some future ones.